Hello everyone, it's Scott and we're back for day 7 at Aetherdrift previews. And we got a lot of interesting cards to talk about today. Before we dive in, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Aetherdrift preview season and beyond. And if you're looking for any cards from Aetherdrift, you can visit us on the web at caffeinatedgamers.tcgplayerpro.com. So let's dive into today's spoilers. So first we've got Riptide Gearhulk for 1, 2 white, and 2 blue mana. You get an artifact creature. That's a construct. It's a 2/5 with double strike and prowess. And when this creature enters the battlefield, for each opponent, put up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls into its owner's library, third from the top. So really powerful abilities on Riptide Gearhulk. So in my mind, it has application across any deck that's playing the Azorious colors, because the double strike on it is really powerful, but also you're going to be able to grow it. You're going to play non-creature spells throughout the course of the game, and every time you do that, your Riptide Gearhulk is going to get +1/+1, and I think that's going to grow it, and you're likely to get, when you attack with it, you're going to be potentially doing 6, 8, 10 damage a turn if your opponent isn't able to block it. And I think that'll bring the game to a close fairly quickly. In the ability that happens when you enter the battlefield with Riptide Gearhulk, where you get to take whatever the best thing is that your opponent has off the battlefield and put it third from the top in their library. So that is likely that it's not going to be drawn for a couple of turns unless they've got a lot of card draw on their deck. So it's going to give you some time to take advantage of Riptide Gearhulk's abilities, and I think that's going to make it standard playable. Where I think this is going to probably see the best fit is we already have an Azorious artifact deck out there around Simulacrum Synthesizer, and I think that deck could use a card like this. Usually it just goes really wide and tall with the construct tokens that it creates, but this is another way. You play this on turn 4 or 5 depending on the mana, and now you've got an alternate way of winning the game potentially. So you're not necessarily just relying on the artifact creature tokens that are created by the synthesizer. So I like that as another option in the deck. So I think this is going to see standard play. Now, is that going to be the best deck for it? But remember, we're going to have this in standard for about 3 years. So I think over the course of that time, we're definitely going to find a deck where this is going to be good in. Next, we've got the Speed Demon for 3 and 2 black mana. You're going to legendary creature. That's a demon. It's 5/5. It has flying and trample with start your engine. And at the beginning of your end step, you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is your speed. So I think this is a really powerful card, and I think it immediately goes into the demon deck because we already know that we're going to be losing some cards eventually from that deck, particularly our 4-drop demon, Archfiend of the Dross, and eventually you're going to need a replacement for it anyways. And I think Speed Demon might be just a better card anyways. And the reason for that is, well, we don't obviously have the countdown to it dying, but it's also going to give you that additional card draw because you cast this at the end of your second main phase. You go to your upkeep. The first time you do it, you're at least getting 1 card, and that's going to be value added here before your opponent can even do anything to Speed Demon. And later in the game, when you have higher max speed, or if we can get a card early in the game, and I'll talk about one in just a minute that I think maybe fits into the deck, then by the time you get Speed Demon in play, you might be at 2, 3, or even 4 speed at that point, and then you're going to be able to get 3 or 4 cards from it every single turn. Now, obviously, this is going to drain through your life, so I think we're going to have to put some more life gain in the deck, but I'm really high on this card in that deck as a source of card draw that hopefully will allow you to do the things you need to win the game. Next, we've got Gas Guzzler for a black mana. You get a Vampire Rogue. That's a 2/1. It's got Start Your Engine, and this creature enters tapped. Its max speed ability is pay 1 black mana and sacrifice another creature or vehicle you control to draw a card. So I think that is, kind of a plus ability and certainly would be good in an aristocrat style deck. But I think where Gas Guzzler is going to have standard playability is obviously in any Start Your Engine deck. It's a 1 mana card. You can play it on turn 1 and you're going to get those max speed abilities started. So you're going to be at 1. Hopefully you can get in and hit your opponent once or twice with Gas Guzzler. And then, you've got other good Start Your Engine cards that have good max speed abilities like the Speed Demon. And I think because of that, I think this is going to be a card that sees play in standard across any black deck that's going to be using the Start Your Engine abilities in it. And even some of the aristocrat style decks that we might have in standard, because that ability to pay 1 mana, sacrifice a creature or a vehicle, draw a card, in the late game, that's going to be a really helpful ability to hopefully draw into the stuff you need to win the game. Next, we've got River Churn Monument for 1 and a blue mana. You get an artifact that you can pay 1 and tap it, and any number of players each mill 2 cards. So that can be you and your opponent. In Commander, it could be all 4 players. So I think that's going to be a powerful ability across formats where you're, for 1 mana, you're going to be getting that millstone effect. Now, obviously, there's requirements a little bit different than Millstone because you have to have blue mana, so it's got to be in a blue deck. But right now, most of the mill stuff we have in Standard is in blue. And it also has a powerful exhaust ability. For 2 and 2 blue mana, you can tap it in any number of target players, each mill cards equal to the number of cards in their graveyard. So, in the mid game, you've been milling your opponent. Maybe they've got 10 or 15 cards. Maybe you've played the Jace and you just, used his ability to have your opponent mill like 15 cards, and now all of a sudden they've got 20 cards or so in their graveyard because of River Churn Monument and Jace, and now you're going to be able to, in essence, almost mill them out at that point just from River Churn Monument's ability and Jace's abilities. So I think this definitely has a home in Standard. Now, is that going to always work out? I don't think so. But certainly any deck that also wants to self-mill to get cards into the graveyard for Delirium or something like that, I think River Churn Monument is a good card for them as well. Next, we've got Afterburner Expert for 2 and a green mana. You get a Goblin Artificer. That's a 4/2. It also has Exhaust for 2 and 2 green mana. You get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on this creature. And whenever you activate an Exhaust ability, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield. I think that's the ability on it that I'm really excited about. We really have a using your Exhaust abilities payoff. Hey, this dies in combat early in the game because it either blocks something or you attacked and your opponent blocked with something that killed it. Okay, great. I'm going to use another Exhaust ability from one of my other cards, and it just comes back to the battlefield. And I think because of that, this is going to be one of potentially the premier Exhaust cards we see in the set. And if you are able to use its own Exhaust ability, okay, you're going to make it a 6/4. And I think at that point, it's going to be really difficult for your opponents to deal with Afterburner Expert. All right, moving on to some of the lower rarity cards for the day. We've got a lot of good uncommons to talk about. And our first is Voyage Home. For 5, a white and a blue mana. You get a sorcery that has affinity for artifacts, and that means that the spell costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. And when you cast it, you draw 3 cards and gain 3 life. So we've talked about already our Gearhulk for the day, and that Gearhulk, obviously there's going to be a deck built around it, and I think Voyage Home is just going to be an easy include in that, or the Simulacrum Synthesizer deck as well, because you're going to have those artifacts in play by the time you actually go ahead and play Voyage Home. So you're probably going to be paying only 2 mana to get your 3 cards and gain that 3 life. So I'm excited about this card in that Affinity style deck. Next, we've got Transit Mage for 2 and a blue mana. You get a Human Wizard, that's a 2/2. And when this creature enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card with mana value 4 or 5, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. Which I think this is really good if you're going to be using a vehicle deck that is going to have a lot of cards that are 4 and 5 mana in it, so you can kind of go get whatever you need. But even in that Simulacron Simulacrum deck, we do have a couple of 4 and 5 mana artifacts that are a part of that deck. So if we really want to have that kind of tutor ability, I can see a couple copies of Transit Mage going in that deck as well. Next, we've got Diversion Unit for 1 and a blue mana. You get an artifact creature, that's a robot, it's a 2/1 with flying. And for 1 blue mana, you can sacrifice this creature and counter a target instant or sorcery spell unless its controller pays 3. So really nice ability on Diversion Unit. And we've had cards like this in the past in Standard where you sacrifice a creature and it can counter a spell. Okay, in this case, an instant or sorcery. And those cards have seen play. So I think this will see play too for that reason, just kind of having, a counter spell on a body. So you can use it as a creature until you're going to be in need of its ability to counter a spell. And then when that time comes up, hey, you pay the 1 blue mana, you counter the spell, and then you go on from there. Next, we've got Slick Imitator. For 1 and a blue mana, you get a creature that's an ooze. It's a 1/3 with Start Your Engine, and at max speed you can pay 1 and sacrifice this creature. Copy target spell you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. So really powerful ability on Slick Imitator where you get to copy a spell for 1 mana, which is well below the normal cost for that. So I think, you play, if you're going to be looking to copy spells in your deck, this is a nice way to do that. So if it's in that style of deck, then it's got some standard playability. Outside of that, it's kind of weak, and I don't think it'll see much standard play otherwise. Next, we've got Gastel Raider. For 2 and a black mana, you get a Vampire Rogue. That's a 2/1. It has Start Your Engine. And when this creature enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose an instant or sorcery card from it. That player discards that card. And once you reach max speed, this creature gets +1/+1 and has Menace. So I think this is a card that any of our discard style decks, if we're really using the idea of really just kind of making the opponent discard their hand, I think this is a card that is at least a sideboard option in those decks. Because if you're playing kind of a control style deck and you want to get rid of their instants and sorceries, you play this on turn 3, you go take out of their hand that instant or sorcery that's going to do the most damage to you, and then you get a 2/1 body that if you reach max speed, then becomes a 3/2 with Menace. And I think that's a pretty good rate for this kind of card. So I expected to see some kind of standard play in a discard style deck. Next, we have Spire Mech Cycle for 4 and a red mana. You get an artifact vehicle. That's a 5/4 with haste. It also has exhaust, and you can tap another untapped mount or vehicle you control, and this vehicle becomes an artifact creature, and you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it for each mount and or vehicle you control other than this vehicle. So if this is in an artifact deck where you've got a bunch of artifact creatures in it or mounts in it, vehicles and mounts in it, then I think this is, kind of a good top end because it's got haste, and even if you don't use it for that ability, it only crews for 2. So I think it's got some playability, again, in that style of deck. Is it good enough for the current red decks that we see in Standard? It's not. So it's going to have that niche style deck where you're playing vehicles for it to see standard play. Next, we've got Dune Drifter for X, a white and a black mana. You get an artifact vehicle, that's a 3/3. And when this vehicle enters, return target artifact or creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So I really like this uncommon because, in the early in the game you probably don't want it, but if you've got a couple copies of it in your deck, hey, and you get it on turn 6 or 7, your opponent's killed some things earlier in the game, then you can get those back by just committing a few extra mana to Dune Drifter, and then you get that body plus Dune Drifter, and it only crews for 2, so to me that makes it standard playable. Next, we've got Veteran Beast Rider for 1, a green and a white mana. You get a Human Knight, that's a 3/4. And at the beginning of your end step, untap each creature you control. And for 2, a green and a white mana, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. What I really like about Veteran Beast Rider is that at your end step, you get to untap all of your creatures. So that means you can attack with everything, knowing that as long as Veteran Beast Rider's in play at the end of your turn, then you're going to be able to untap all of your creatures and use them as blockers if you need to. So I really like that ability on Beast Rider. So in a deck that really wants that kind of ability, I think Veteran Beast Rider is a good fit for those style of decks. Next, we've got Racer's Scoreboard for 4 mana. You get an artifact with Start Your Engine. And when this artifact enters, you draw 2 cards and then discard a card. So, on rate there, it's not a good card. But at max speed, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So that's, I think, the selling point of Racer's Scoreboard is that cost reduction, and it's not on an instant or sorcery or an artifact. It's any spell that you would cast. So to me, if you're looking for a way to discount your spells because you want to play 5 and 6 mana cards, then Racer's Scoreboard might be an option if you have a consistent way of reaching max speed and getting that added ability. Outside of that, I don't think it sees much play. Now, in Limited, it probably will be a very good card in that format. Next, we've got Detention Chariot for 4 and 2 white mana. You get an artifact vehicle, that's a 6/6. And when this vehicle enters the battlefield, exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls until this vehicle leaves the battlefield. So it's a Brutal Cathar effect, but it's on an artifact, so if it's not a creature, then spot removal can't kill it. They have to have specifically artifact removal. It does crew for 3, so that's a little bit high on the crewing side, and obviously the 6 mana that it costs to get it in play is limiting on it, but it does have cycle as well for 1 white mana, so there's some flexibility in this. I don't think it sees standard play, but it does have enough flexibility in it that it might find its way into a deck that wants those abilities. Next, we've got Spike Shell Harrier for 4 and a blue mana. You get an artifact creature, that's a robot turtle, and is a 4/4. And when this creature enters the battlefield, return target creature or vehicle an opponent controls to its owner's hand. If that opponent's speed is greater than each other player's speed, reduce that opponent's speed by 1. This effect can't reduce their speed below 1. So interesting abilities on Spike Shell Harrier. So I think in Limited, it's definitely going to be a really nice card because you're going to be able to force your opponent to have to recast the best card they have on the battlefield, and you're going to get it off the table for at least 1 turn, and I think that's a decent ability in Limited. Now, is it standard playable? Probably not for 5 mana. Next, we've got Trade the Helm for 4 and a blue mana. You get a sorcery, and you can exchange control target artifact or creature you control and target artifact or creature an opponent controls, and you can cycle it for 2. So I think in Limited it's a good card. Taking their best creature late in the game and giving them a cheap artifact or a bad creature that makes perfect sense to me in the limited format, but I don't think this is good enough to see standard play. Next, we've got Roadside Assistance for 2 and a white mana. You get an enchantment, that's an aura, and you can enchant a vehicle or a creature. And when this aura enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 colorless pilot artifact creature token. With this token saddles, mounts, and crews vehicles as though its power were 2 greater. Enchanted permanent gets +1/+1 and has lifelink. So, a nice enchantment. The fact that it does give a creature lifelink, I think, has value in standard. I wish it was 2 mana to get all of that, because we have cards that are 2 mana that give you similar things. Maybe not the body, but it gives you the plus and it gives you the lifelink ability. So I'm not seeing this as a card that's likely to see a lot of standard play, but in limited, a really nice card. Next, we've got Risen Necro Regent for 4 and a black mana. You get a zombie cat knight. That's a 5/4 with Start Your Engine. And when you reach max speed at the beginning of your end step, you get to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Okay, so I think this is a card that, if we do have a cat stack, then maybe this finds its way into that. But 5 mana, is a lot to pay in standard for this kind of ability, and there's no guarantee that you're going to have your Start the Engine activated to max speed when you bring Risen Necro Regent into play. So I think that makes it difficult to want to put this in a deck. Now, if we do have a zombie deck, then maybe it fits in there. But outside of a zombie or a cat deck, I don't think it's going to see much standard play. Now, in limited, again, probably a good card for your deck in limited. Next, we've got Reckless Velocitor. For 3 and a red mana, you get a Minotaur pilot. That's a 3/3, and whenever this creature saddles a mount or crews a vehicle during your main phase, that mount or vehicle gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. It's a card that will be limited playable, but probably not beyond that. Next, we've got Thundering Broodwagon for 2 black and 2 green mana. You get an artifact that's a vehicle and is a 6/5. It also has Menace and Reach. When this vehicle enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 4 or less, and it crews for 3, and also you can cycle it for 2. So in limited, I think this is a very, very good card to have in your limited pull. So if you get it, or in a draft, a card I would certainly want to take. But again, given what we already have for our Gruul deck, I just don't think it's going to be good enough in Gruul right now to see standard play. All right, let's go to the commons we got today and talk about them. So first is Collision Course for 1 and a white mana. You get a sorcery. You get to choose 1. Collision Course deals X damage to target creature, where X is the number of permanents you control that are creatures and or vehicles, or you can destroy an artifact. So this is a card that, on the surface doesn't look all that great, but I think in that Simulacrum Simulacron deck, this is where I think that could be a really good card, because you're going to have a lot of artifacts in play. So because of that, you're going to be able to do 5, 6, 7 damage or more to an opponent's creature. So under those circumstances, I think it's a good sideboard option for those decks. And maybe you would want it for that artifact destruction, because we know obviously the set's got a ton of artifacts in it. So I think as a sideboard option, it's possibly playable, but outside of that, I don't think it's going to see much standard play at all. Next, we've got Daring Mechanic for 2 and a white mana. You get a Human Artificer. That's a 3/3. And for 3 and a white mana, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target mount or vehicle. Limited playable only. Next, we've got Gastro Blockbuster for 2 and a red mana. You get a Human Berserker. That's a 3/2. And when this vehicle enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature or vehicle. When you do, destroy target artifact an opponent controls. So as long as you've got an artifact or a vehicle you can sacrifice, then you can go ahead and kill the best artifact your opponent has. So in limited, definitely a good card, but probably not good enough for standard because we've got cards like Abrade. Next, we've got Loxodon Surveyor. For 2 and a green mana, you get an Elephant Scout. That's a 3/3 with Start Your Engine. And when you reach max speed, you can pay 3 and exile this card from your graveyard and draw a card. So it has to die to get there, so limited playable at best. Next, we've got Ether Jacket for 3 mana. You get an artifact creature. That's a Thopter and is a 2/1. It's got flying and vigilance, and you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice this creature to destroy another target artifact, activate only as a sorcery. So again, in that limited pool, I think this is a good card to have because it can kill another artifact, but I don't think it's good enough for standard play. And our last card of the day is Scrap Compactor. For 1 mana, you get an artifact where you can pay 3 and sacrifice this artifact. It deals 3 damage to any target, or you can pay 6 mana and tap it and sacrifice this artifact to destroy target creature or vehicle. So it's a really costly removal spell that maybe if I don't have better options in limited, I would use, but outside of that, it's not going to see play at all. All right, those were the previews for day 7 of Aetherdrift. So thanks for staying to the end of the video. And remember, if you're looking for cards from Aetherdrift, you can check us out on the web at caffeinatedgamers.tcgplayerpro.com. And I've left links here to our Aetherdrift preview list of videos and our most recent one as well. So I will see you in the next one. Thanks.